boy too poor to bury his own parents grew up to put the men who built his empire to death, and he did it with paperwork. Zhu Yuanzhang ran China from 1368 to 1398. He founded the Ming Dynasty, the one that built most of what tourists now photograph in Beijing, and for 3 decades he spent his power on something no ruler before him had managed at this scale. He hunted down the people who had helped him win, and he killed them by the tens of thousands, and he wrote it all down. Zhu was born around 1328 into a peasant family that owned nothing in the long decline of Mongol rule over China. What that poverty would make of him got decided 16 years later. Start in 1344 in a village near Fengyang in what is now Anhui province. Zhu is 16 years old. A plague moves through the region that summer and takes his father, his mother, and at least one of his brothers inside a matter of weeks. The family has nothing. There is no money for coffins, no money even for the cloth you wrap a body in before you put it in the ground. A teenage boy is left standing over his dead parents with no proper way to bury them. That detail is not atmosphere. It is the engine of everything that follows. With the family gone and the fields dead, Zhu did the only thing a destitute boy in that region could do. He went to the monastery. The Huangjue Temple in Fengyang took him in at around 16, and not because he had any calling for the Buddha. He went because monks ate. For a while that worked. Then the temple itself ran short of food, and it did what struggling institutions always do, which is push its newest and least important member back out the door. So Zhu became a wandering beggar-monk walking the roads of Henan and Anhui with a bowl, sleeping wherever the night caught him, for something close to 3 years. 3 years of that rewires a person. He saw the famine from the floor of it. He learned which villages had grain and which did not, which officials skimmed the relief, and which let people starve at the roadside, who got fed and who got left for the dogs. He came back to the Huangjue Temple around 1347 and stayed roughly 4 more years, and during that second stretch something happened that bent the course of Chinese history. He learned to read. A peasant farmer's son did not learn to read. There was no road to it. The monastery handed him one. He worked through the Buddhist texts, absorbed their whole language of purity and corruption and moral order, and he carried that vocabulary back out the gate when he left around 1352 to join the Red Turbans, a Buddhist millenarian rebellion against the Mongol Yuan rulers who then held China. That word millenarian carries more weight than it looks. The Red Turbans were not only anti-Mongol, they were apocalyptic, organised around the conviction that the rotten old order had to come down so a clean one could rise out of the rubble. So Zhu stepped out of a monastery that had trained him to divide the world into the pure and the corrupt, and straight into a movement that wanted to put the corrupt half to the torch. The monk did not stop being a monk when he took up a sword. He simply found a larger congregation. Decades later, when he was calling his own ministers corrupt and signing off on their deaths by the thousand, he was not improvising a new cruelty. He was finishing an old sermon. The two halves of those years did not cancel out. They fused. Zhu came out of the monastery able to write imperial edicts, and the edicts he later wrote drip with contempt. Contempt for officials who had never once been hungry, who had never wrapped a parent in nothing because there was nothing to wrap them in. He hated the comfortable educated class with the specific heat of a man who had begged at their gates and been turned away. He also, by the end, hated the men who had been hungry right alongside him. That second hatred is the one that makes him interesting, and it takes 30 years to come fully into view, so hold on to it. The rebellion years I will move through fast because the military rise, impressive as it genuinely was, is not where this story lives. Zhu was a gifted commander, no argument there. He out-organised, out-fought and outweighted every rival warlord in the wreckage of the collapsing Yuan, and in 1368 he took the throne and named his reign Hongwu, vastly martial. An orphan beggar had become the Emperor of China in 24 years. By any sane measure, that is the triumphant ending, the part where the credits roll. It was the opening of the part that earns him his title. To understand the next 30 years, you have to understand what those monastery and begging years had done to his sense of who could be trusted. Zhu trusted power he had personally handed to a man, and almost nothing else. A general he had promoted, a minister he had lifted out of obscurity, that he could live with, because the man owed everything to him, and had no standing of his own to fall back on. What he could not tolerate was independent reputation. A scholar respected for his learning, a commander beloved by his troops, an old comrade with his own history and his own followers, any of these was a man whose loyalty did not run entirely through Zhu, and a loyalty that did not run entirely through him was, to his mind, a loyalty waiting to be turned. The literacy he picked up in the temple let him write all of this into law and edict. The hunger he never lost taught him that anyone above him in the old order had once let him starve and would do it again the moment it suited them. Put those two together in one man holding total power, and you get the reign that followed. Before the real killing began, Zhu built the apparatus that would carry it out, the Jinyiwei, the Embroidered Uniform Guard, named for the distinctive embroidered coats the men wore. On paper, they were an imperial bodyguard. In practice, they were something the Chinese state had not formally fielded before, a political secret police answering to one person and to no one else. Their work was watching. Wikipedia puts it about as plainly as it can be put, that one of the early duties of the Jinyiwei was to help the emperor spy on his own subjects, and across the sources they keep turning up described the same way as the eyes and ears of the emperor. They reported on ministers, on generals, on scholars, on what got said at private dinners after the wine had loosened a few tongues. They ran a prison of their own, the Zhenfusi, which sat apart from the ordinary judicial system, where a suspect could be held without reference to normal law. What made them dangerous was not cruelty, which any jailer can supply on demand. It was that they reported straight to Zhu and to no court, which turned denunciation into the natural weather of his government. Any official could be named by another. Any conversation could come back around to find you. If you served the Ming under Hongwu, you governed with the working knowledge that the man at the next desk might be writing down your name. Then comes the date that outweighs every other in his reign, the 12th of February, 1380. On that day, Zhu had his Grand Chancellor Weiyong executed, along with the Censor-in-Chief Chen Ning. The official charge was a coup. Hu, the story ran, had secretly conspired with Mongols and with Japanese pirates to murder the emperor. Modern historians do not believe a syllable of it. The conspiracy charge reads as fabricated, or wrung out under the kind of conditions that produce whatever confession the interrogator orders. There is a famous flourish, repeated for centuries, that soldiers were discovered hidden inside the walls of Hu's mansion, waiting to spring the assassination. Scholars now treat that as a later invention, the sort of vivid scene that gets bolted onto a record long after the bodies are cold. What Hu had or had not actually done barely matters, because his execution was never the point. The point arrived in the days right after. Zhu abolished the office of Grand Chancellor, not Hu's tenure in it, the office. He dissolved the entire Central Secretariat, the administrative body that had run Chinese civil government for the better part of 1,000 years, and then he issued an edict declaring that any future emperor who tried to revive the post, and any official who so much as proposed reviving it, would be put to death. He did not sack a minister. He deleted the position of Prime Minister from the Chinese state and made its restoration a capital crime forever. Every strand of executive authority that had been distributed across a sprawling government now ran into one pair of hands, his. No cabinet sitting above the ministries, no chancellor standing between the throne and the machinery of empire. No ruler in Chinese history had ever gripped administrative control this direct or this complete. In a flat operational sense, he had just made himself the entire executive branch of the largest state on earth. The Purge did not close with 2 executions either, and this is the feature that lifts Hu Weiyong out of the ordinary register of court bloodletting into something far colder. Historians group it as the first of the 4 major cases, the 4 great state purges that ran through the early Ming, and it set the template the others would follow. Zhu reopened the investigation again and again across the next decade. Every reopening dragged in a fresh ring of people. The logic was guilt by association, applied with a sort of recursive patience that is genuinely hard to look at directly. They took the accused, then the distant relatives of the accused, then the men who had worked under him, then those men's patrons and the protégés they had sponsored, then the relatives of the protégé, each wave naming the next, the circle widening for 10 unbroken years. By the time it finally burned itself out, the dead numbered somewhere between 30 and 40,000. That figure comes from Edward Dreyer, and it helps to know who he was before taking it on faith. Dreyer earned his doctorate at Harvard with a dissertation on the rise of Zhu himself, titled The Emergence of Zhu Yuanzhang, which is only the older spelling of the same name, written under John Fairbank and Lin Shengyang, two of the towering figures in the Western study of Imperial China. He became the leading authority on the military side of Zhu's career, the campaigns and command structures I skated past earlier, and his work sits underneath the Cambridge history of China's account of the whole period. When the man who spent his life reconstructing how Zhu won puts the dead from this single purge in that range, the number arrives with weight behind it. Some accounts push the total past 50,000 once you fold in the full decade of follow-on waves. Either way, a single accusation against a single chancellor had bred outward into the killing of tens of thousands of people, most of whom had nothing to do with any plot because in all likelihood there had been no plot at all. It would be a mistake to read those 10 years of reopened files as a man losing his grip. The opposite is closer to the truth. Each forced confession that named 3 more names was the system functioning exactly as designed. Reopening the case was not the act of a ruler who could not let go of an old grievance. It was the act of a ruler who had found a tool that worked and saw no reason to put it down. As long as the investigation stayed officially open, anyone in the empire could be folded into it on a single denunciation, and the longer it ran, the more thoroughly it cleared out the precise category of person Zhu wanted gone. The slowness was the genius of it. A man who killed 40,000 in a single afternoon would have triggered a rebellion. A man who killed them a few hundred at a time, over a decade, under the cover of legal proceedings, met almost no resistance at all. The cleanest illustration of how far that circle reached is a man named Li Shanchang. Li was no minor clerk caught at the edge of the net. He was one of Zhu's oldest comrades, a founding strategist of the Ming, a man who had stood at his side since the rebel years when the throne was still a daydream. He had helped design the dynasty itself. In 1390, a full decade after Weiyong lost his head, the old conspiracy was reopened one more time, and Li Shanchang's name got pulled into it backward, retroactively. He was ordered to take his own life. More than 70 members of his family were executed alongside him. 70 people put to death for proximity to a plot that did not exist, 10 years after the original execution, attached to a man who had helped build the very throne now commanding his suicide. This is what the founding generation got. Li was not the exception. He was the rule with a name on it. The whole apparatus of the Purge served one real function, and it was not the security of the realm. It was the patient erasure of every official who held independent standing, his own history, his own legitimacy, his own memory of the years when Zhu had been one beggar among many rather than the son of heaven. The men who could remember him hungry were precisely the men who could not be allowed to live. And here is the part that separates Zhu from the usual run of paranoid despots. He was not killing in a frenzy. He kept files. Every one of these cases came with named victims, written accusations, formal judicial proceedings, a paper trail produced and preserved by the state. Most tyrants leave behind chaos and a rough guess at the casualties. Zhu left behind an archive. The man wanted his enemies dead, yes, but he also wanted the documentation, the receipts, the orderly record of who had been removed and on what stated grounds. There is something more chilling in that bureaucratic tidiness than in any amount of hot-blooded slaughter. The killing was a clerical operation. 13 years into his reign, he was somehow only getting started. In 1393, he turned the same machinery on the army. Lan Yu was one of the most decorated commanders the early Ming possessed, the general whose campaigns had pinned down the northern frontier and kept the Mongols off it. He was accused of treason and executed, and his case became the second of what later historians bundled together as the 4 major cases of the early Ming. As with Weiyong, the accusation was the doorway and not the destination. The Lan Yu case was the lever used to reach into the officer corps and haul out commander after commander, family after family. I have to be straight with you about something here because the alternative is feeding you mythology dressed up as fact. If you have run into other tellings of this story, you have almost certainly heard very precise numbers hung on the Lan Yu Purge. 15,000 executed, 10,000 Japanese swords supposedly unearthed at his residence as planted evidence. Those figures circulate everywhere. They also fall apart the moment you press on them. Try to trace either one back to solid secondary scholarship, and it simply dissolves in your hands. The base fact holds up fine. Lan Yu was killed in 1393, and the case swept up large numbers of military men and their relatives. The tidy body counts do not hold up. so I am not going to hand you a number I cannot stand behind. The honest version is that we know the shape of the slaughter without knowing its precise size, and anyone who recites an exact figure is selling you a confidence the sources never earned. Now the comfortable version of this whole story falls apart, and the comfortable version is the one you've probably been handed. It goes like this. Brilliant peasant claws his way up from nothing, despises the soft and corrupt scholar class, and spends his reign grinding the educated elite under his heel. Tyrant on one side of the line, helpless victims on the other. Clean and satisfying. It is also mostly false. The historian John Dardis spent a career dismantling that picture. He threw out the too easy stories the field had been telling itself. The Ming was not, in his reading, a military dictatorship that a soldier had clamped onto the country by force, and it was not a peasant revolution that had washed the old elite into the sea either. Both versions missed the stranger thing that actually happened. In his book Confucianism and Autocracy, working through 128 collected works written between 1340 and 1400, he argued something that makes the whole affair more disturbing rather than less. The Confucian scholars were not simply the prey of Ming autocracy, they were its architects. The literati, the educated men Zhu both needed and despised, actively helped construct the machinery of absolute imperial power, and many of them did it because they wanted it. They carried their own vision of moral order and social repair, and a single overwhelming ruler who could finally discipline a corrupt and disordered world looked, to a fair number of them, like the very instrument that would deliver the world they dreamed about. So the men being shoveled into the Purge were, in real part, the same class of men who had drafted the blueprint for the apparatus now shoveling them in. They built the throne that went on to swallow them whole. That is a far darker story than tyrant versus innocence, and it happens to be the one the evidence actually supports. A fair question by now is how anyone knows any of this with confidence, and the answer demands one honest caveat. Most of these body counts come down to us through the Ming Shilu, the veritable records compiled by the court itself. A court keeping the official ledger of its own emperor's purges is not a neutral witness, and never was. The numbers may run high, partly because a frightened bureaucracy had every reason to magnify the emperor's reach as a standing warning to everyone still drawing breath. 30 to 40,000 is the figure modern historians have settled on after weighing exactly that bias, not a raw court boast swallowed whole. The uncertainty around the precise count is real. The order of magnitude is not seriously in dispute. Zhu Yuanzhang died in 1398, in his own bed, which is more than he granted most of the men who had put him there. The chancellorship he abolished stayed abolished. No Ming emperor ever brought it back, exactly as he had ordered, and the dynasty he founded ran on for 276 years, atop the all-powerful throne he had carved out by emptying the room of everyone who remembered him small. The Jinyiwei outlasted him too, watching and filing and denouncing long after the man who raised them was gone. The boy who could not afford to bury his parents finished his life as the most administratively absolute ruler China had ever produced, sitting alone at the summit of a government he had personally cleared of every old friend he ever had. He got the thing he wanted. There was almost no one left alive who had known him before he had it,